Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Michael Daniel, and I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Thank you for joining us for this discussion of the Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015 and the reauthorization discussion. It's a really important discussion. It may not seem like it on the surface, and there seems to be a lot of fuss about something that seems rather straightforward, but that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm really pleased to be joined by such a great panel of experts in this area. I'm going to go around and let them all introduce themselves so you know who you're talking to. So Kemba, why don't we start with you?
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for having me on today's webinar. I'm Kemba Walden. I'm the president of the Paladin Global Institute, which is a think tank inside of a private capital enterprise, bringing tech innovation to policymakers and vice versa. But relevant to this conversation, I was a lawyer for the predecessor to CISA at the time that CISA 2015 came online, and then a legal practitioner at Microsoft during the heyday of CISA 2015.
Okay, thanks, Kemba. Ari?
I'm Ari Schwartz. I'm Executive Director of the Cybersecurity Coalition, and I'm Managing Director of Cybersecurity Services at Venable.
Okay, thank you. Amy?
Hi, Amy Shuart. I'm the Vice President of Technology and Innovation Policy at the Business Roundtable, which is an association representing CEOs of generally Fortune 500 companies.
Great. Mike?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks for pulling this together. My name is Mike Flynn. I'm a Vice President and Counsel at ITI. We're a global technology trade association. In my capacity, I work on our government relations team. I handle national security issues, but most relevant to this conversation, I spent just under 10 years on the Hill, House and Senate side, on the Homeland Security committees, working on cybersecurity just after the CIS 15 passed.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. So why don't we just start with the basics, I think. What does this statute do? What activities does it actually authorize? Kemba, maybe we can start with you since you were counsel at DHS then.
Sure. To make it short, it is there to serve three purposes. The most important to this conversation of which is to encourage and incentivize information sharing between private sector entities, non-federal entities, between federal entities and non-federal entities, and to protect things like from FOIA disclosure, to protect it from things like antitrust violations. It enhances some privacy protections that we'll talk about in a little bit, but it encourages information sharing, not just information sharing, but defensive measures and cyber threat indicators for a cybersecurity purpose. Those are all three loaded words that mean something very specific, and at the same time, they're also very vague. But it is to encourage it without fear of reputational harm, of liability, of disclosure of information that you don't otherwise want out in the public. It's to get after the problem.
Yep. And I think, when I look at the statute, and at the time I was in the White House as the National Cybersecurity Coordinator and spent a long time working on getting various versions of this across the finish line. I think really at the end of the day, it was designed to enable, as you said, both the private sector to send information to the government and for the private sector to share information with each other. It also actually put the onus on the government to make sure that it was sharing information with the private sector as well, which is not as a piece that isn't talked about as much in the statute, but it actually did put a positive requirement on the federal government to share information out to the private sector in a timely manner as well. Ari, other sort of perspectives on what the statute authorizes?
Well, when the statute was being discussed, I remember this one way back. I mean, we've talked about this issue for many years before 2015. We did some, we would have meetings on the subject when I was in government and ask companies what they were looking for in information sharing, and ask the government side what they were looking. And I'd say that the kind of number one issue that came up on the concerns was the privacy laws and concerns about privacy issues in the sharing and in sharing, and that there was concern that even if they were had made some had redacted a lot of information from the and made it only very tailored to a particular purpose, that there could be some tidbit of information that gets put in there and they're technically violating one of the laws, and that kept the lawyers from keeping lawyers worried about liability concerns kept the companies from sharing. There was also as Kemba said, the open meeting and open information laws, Freedom of Information Act, and others. Again, concerns about like technical violations of groups getting together that might in some ways be seen as violating, even though they're sharing only technical information in these cases. And then the third concern we have was the private to private on the private to private side was antitrust and competition laws. I think those were the top three areas where there were concerns. Again, and there was actually when Michael and I, when you and I were in government, we had DOJ and FTC put together a letter, and they basically said, we don't see how you can actually win a case bringing it on the antitrust grounds, considering that the purpose of gathering this information would be for the benefit of everyone that should be sharing this information if you were really doing it for threat sharing purposes. But that this concern was still there that you could be sued for it, even though the person suing you would probably lose, and so that was still a concern to some of the companies and the lawyers involved in the space. So those are generally the three areas that we heard the most about.
Yeah, and Mike, what did you were on the Hill during some of this. What were you hearing the same things that Ari was just discussing there?
I was, and to kind of pull together some threads from Kemba and Ari, I think it's notable that we started this conversation back in roughly 2010. Not to date myself, I was in law school, so I missed that part of this conversation.
Oh,
But
fine,
oh yeah,
fine.
so but when I entered this conversation, roughly 2011, 2012, there were something like 111 co-sponsors of the House version of CISPA, the Cyber Information Sharing Act, which came out of the intelligence committees. But it gives you a sense of it took 4 years to get it done, even though you had 111 bipartisan co-sponsors on a bill, because the privacy concerns were so serious, as Ari rightly kind of articulated there. There was so much concern around, and this is where I'm bringing Kemba's, I think rightly said something to the sort of like the loaded words that in this statute were so kind of closely scrutinized, so closely like wordsmith to hit and to balance concerns from the privacy community, privacy and civil liberties advocates closely watched this for years and years and years, but also to address the concerns from the cybersecurity community, from the national security folks who were trying to make sure that this still did the thing we all wanted it to do, which was to remove that chilling effect from lawyers being in a conversation. I can say that as a lawyer myself. We're to slow the process down. If you're thinking about sharing information and there could be regulatory or other risk liability out there, it's going to give folks a moment of pause, which is what we were hearing on the Hill so much. Was there was broad consensus. Everyone kind of agrees we should share more, from the Obama administration to industry folks, even privacy and civil liberty folks agree this was a good goal. It was getting there that was so challenging, which I think is a little bit lost. I think it's important to remind everyone, every stakeholder in this conversation, especially our friends on the Hill, how challenging it was to get this over the line in the first place.
Yeah, great. Amy.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth remembering what other things were happening around the time here too. So in 2015, you had the OPM
Mhm.
breach, so affected so many Americans with their personal information. But going back to 2013, you had the Snowden leaks. So that certainly was a part of the conversation there as well, that when thinking about this law was something to think about.
Yeah, and I remember many conversations with, different companies and things where the reasons to not share information were always larger than the reasons to share information. But Mike, I would say we've been arguing about needing to share more information going back to like 1992. I mean,
Mm,
if you look at, reports and things, they all recommend increased information sharing. You probably dig one out from the 70s.
mm.
So it's definitely been a long-standing problem. And I think part of the issue was, at least some of it was, in fact, these definitional questions. You made the point about, that again, oftentimes in statute, like the definition section is not the most important part of where they define the terms in the law. But in this case, it was actually extremely important to define what a cyber threat indicator is, to define what a defensive measure is, to define what a mitigation is, because that actually provided a lot of the clarity that legal counsel was actually looking for, because they could say, if it's this part, then we're okay. If it's this kind of thing, then it's clearly covered.
I think
Uh,
it's go for it, Ari.
I was going to say, I mean, you got to remember that CISPA, the predecessor bill that Mike mentioned, that had a lot of support, bipartisan support. The Obama administration threatened to veto, and part of the reason was because of that breadth that was there on the definition of on cyber threat, and that it could be so broad, et cetera. And the idea of CISA 2015 was to narrow that substantially, so you're only having certain areas. And I think that's come true. I think that's what the way that it was implemented, and we can talk a little bit about that more later. But I do think I mean, that's the really where a lot of the privacy concern came from. For the whole process is that this was, yeah, you're trying to do this for a good cause, and there are reasons to do this, but if we don't limit it in certain ways, you're going to be able to drive all sorts of sharing that people want to do. The next time some major cyber incident happens, or even just a terrorist incident, that we just blow all the guardrails off out of the way that were put in place temporarily, and that the law didn't have the strong enough guardrails in place for that. I think CISA 2015 changed the mind of some people. There were still a lot of privacy advocates that were against it at the time, and because they were still concerned that those guardrails were not enough in the bill. So
I just add one more observation I might be older than some of you, but a latecomer, because I came into the CISA 2015 challenge at the time DHS was receiving a lot of cybersecurity authorizations. So I came in after this was passed. But something that struck me as a lawyer is that this is a positive law. Typically, you don't see laws that authorize private sector entities to do things. Really, you have laws where private sector entities cannot break them or run afoul. But this one was authorizing the private sector to monitor its own networks for a cybersecurity purpose, notwithstanding any other law, meaning notwithstanding the Secured, Communications Act or whatever it is.
Right.
But it was, so that's one thing. But as a lawyer implementing, once I came out of the government, those carefully defined terms, cyber threat indicators and defensive measures, were specific, but at the same time, they were general. Like they were too amorphous to be able to explain to the client what they can and can't do. Same with cybersecurity purpose. And I think as we move through this conversation and we start talking about what the next version of this could look like, I have a feeling that the next version of this would have to do something with those definitions in order to make it a little bit more crisp about what entities can and can't do, keeping in mind that this is a positive law authorizing private sector entities to share with each other, which is already kind of funky.
I think,
Yeah.
Kemba, I think you're so profoundly right on. I hope the way that Congress is going to take this conversation in terms of updating terminology to reflect both the evolution of technology and how it stands today, but also as a result, unfortunately, the threat landscape that evolves with technology. Ransomware was not a topic that we were talking about a ton in 2013, 2012. And as Amy pointed out, the OPM data breach, massive, right? Like those kinds of events have become unfortunately much more common, and so updating terms to reflect that threat landscape makes a great deal of sense to me. And that's we testified, our general counsel at ITI testified in front of the House Homeland Security Committee last week to offer recommendations on what improvements could be made. And those were the recommendations that we were offering. Think about supply chain attacks. Think about AI and how that factors into this equation. Can the law be written in a more specific way to give more clarity to lawyers and folks trying to implement and interpret it? I think the challenge is political insofar as there isn't a lot of time left in the congressional calendar. This expires on September 30th. So the message that we've been giving to Congress is this is the right conversation to be having, but let's make sure that this authority doesn't lapse because the gears of Congress are turning more slowly, perhaps than they used to, and there aren't as many kind of moving legislative vehicles that we can hitch a ride to. There's good conversation, but just want to be mindful of that we're all operating on a deadline.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that in just a minute because actually that sunset clause is part of the reason that we're actually having this conversation, right? Was because that was one of the guardrails that was put in place when this law was passed, which was it was given a sunset. It was 10 years. So it expires on, as Mike said, September 30th of 2025, which is not that far in the future in, legislative terms. In fact, it's actually tomorrow in legislative
Yes,
terms.
absolutely.
So, that deadline is very quickly approaching. But before we turn to some of that, what were some of the other? I mean, we've talked about some of the definitional limitations, but were there other guardrails that were put in place in the legislation? And maybe we could talk about sort of that and sort of the implementation guidance that came out of the statute as well. Ari, maybe we'll start with you on that.
I mean, so you have those definitions, I think, kind of curb both the types of information and the uses of the information,
Right.
and which I think was sort of essential to figuring out exactly what we meant by cyber threats. But it does limit quite a bit what it can be used for in ways that CISPA did not. So it ended up setting up those guardrails, but also, is part of the discussion of some of these things that we're discussing now. So I think those were the main ones. I'm trying to think of the other ones. Maybe Kemba can add on as the lawyer in the group here, or is it one of the lawyers in the
You,
group?
Michael, Mike, and Ari can explain the background on this, but the language is very specific about not being used for regulatory enforcement purposes, so that
Right.
it would get it's through a process that goes through DHS, so an information sharing process that goes through DHS and cannot be used for regulatory enforcement purposes, which is one of the reasons why, as a NPPD predecessor lawyer to CISA, the lawyers often advocated for CISA not becoming an enforcement agency in order to preserve
Mhm.
that ability to facilitate information sharing. Because one of the things that I understand the private sector to be concerned about was that any information you give over to the government, singular, the government, could be used against you. And that was one of the reasons why for so long CISA argued, NPPD's predecessor argued not to be an enforcement agency. But that was one of the guardrails, is that it could not be used for regulatory enforcement purposes. It could be used for taking the lessons and crafting regulations that would help cybersecurity, but not for enforcement purposes.
Yeah, that was also a great point of tension inside the administration because the law enforcement community very much did not want the information to only flow through CISA and have the protections only adhere to information that was shared with CISA. So one of the other balancing acts was actually to require CISA to pass that information along to the other agencies in the government in a timely manner without impeding it. And there's all sorts of language in the statute that you could just picture the staffers in the room like trying out different words to, see what worked. I think that was sort of the driver behind that. But I think, Amy, you were right to sort of say that was also in a context when Snowden and other things are still very much on people's minds. So there was a great deal of reluctance to have sort of a big pipe of information, what was perceived to be a big pipe of information going, to law enforcement, let alone something like NSA or something like that.
Well, and I think too, from a business perspective, it changes the dynamic. If it's a voluntary sharing, but it could be used for regulatory enforcement, then why would you choose to share information? Because it might come back to cause a regulatory action against you. So part of what's nice about CISA 2015 is it really does set up a good environment for the sharing of information so that we can all be stronger together.
Yeah, so I think, one of the things I wanted to hit on before we kind of turn to, okay, so what do we do now? You know, look at some of the activities that CISA has supported over the last 10 years because and talk about sort of how it's actually worked in practice. I could say as running the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is an information sharing organization, like we exist partially as a result of CISA 2015. The antitrust protections for sharing of information among cybersecurity companies is very, very important to the operation of CTA and the activities that we do. You can look at the number of ISACs that have uh, come about, that have been founded since, they existed beforehand, but you can see the real growth in it after CISA 2015. Um, I think probably all of us have examples. I don't know if people want to share them of ways that we've seen this statute actually work in practice.
I think it's a great question. Right, there's one thing I feel like always gets left to the side of this, which I really enjoy, which is the sticks and the fact that we've started using a common taxonomy to share information, which not everyone loves. And there was always heartburn as we were creating. I shouldn't say we, as I was in Congress. I'm a lawyer. I can't code, but sticks and taxion don't ask me what it stands for. But that common taxonomy, that common language that people were sharing information, was such a benefit to everyone. And again, some folks came along kicking and screaming because anytime you have a standards conversation, there are folks that want to do it in a different way, or they've been doing it in a particular language or a particular model for years and years and years. So now you're asking them to change. That's growing pains. Get that. But at this point, my understanding from security operations center practitioners is sticks and taxi is how it's done. So that is a real win coming from CISA 15 that now we're all speaking the same language, sharing in a common form that does make the data piece of this, the big data analytics piece, I think a lot easier.
So just for those on the webinar who are like me and don't necessarily know what sticks taxi is, I just want to, so the statute required DHS to create a process for automated information sharing. And the technology that was chosen was the sticks taxi technology. And like Mike, I don't know what they stand for, but it's technology that you deploy in order to be able to facilitate that automated information sharing. And that's for indicators, IoT, not IoT, indicators of compromise, IOCs, to be able to get the low hanging fruit. It's debatable whether it worked. What is, I think, true that I would say out loud that's true is that it's necessary. But it's debate. I accept it's debatable whether it worked.
I would say this, Kemba, which is, I mean, I do think it is sort of debatable how, I mean, because some people really don't like the specific of the particular standards. But I would say that prior to 2015, the main way of sharing was people had Excel files, right? And they would email them with a long, long list of the information that was there, and then you could like, if you wanted to bring it over to your system, you could export it into a file that you could use, and then kind of pull that all in based on like the tab delimited set that you set up based on the Excel file. After since 2015, we moved to automated sharing. Period. That was the goal of the bill, more than the specific one type of standard that was being selected to do it. That has happened it is successful in my view. We don't, I mean, for the most part, people still share a lot of email, but I would say the main way of sharing is no longer Excel files as attachments to emails, right? Which is a big victory for being able to actually share information and make sure that we're doing it in a way that can work and scale.
Absolutely. And by the way, STIX, Structured Threat Intelligence Exchange. That's the
Yes.
acronym. And we're actually on to STIX 2.1. We're up to the second first prime, derivative
Hmm.
of that standard, and it really has become a global standard. We use it for CTA, and that enables our automated sharing. We move something on the order of 350,000 pieces of data a day using that standard, and there's no way that we could have done that if we were still sharing Excel files or the dreaded PDF of long lists of IP addresses and domain names. So it has very much facilitated that, and it's really caused the growth of other things like MITRE ATT&CK, which is another framework for how you actually define adversary techniques, tactics, and techniques and their procedures, and really building on. So it really, CISA 2015 is the foundation for an entire ecosystem of sharing that exists today. And what I think is really interesting is that I think this is another example of where the statute has actually accomplished its goals and it's worked pretty well. We actually have not, to my knowledge, had a lot of issues. A lot of the privacy concerns have not come about. I haven't seen reports of any. I haven't encountered any. I think some of that is because, in fact, most of the information that like my companies in CTA need to share to do their job, the vast majority of it's really not affecting privacy all that much. Um, with the sole exception of IP addresses, where we could have a whole other webinar to debate
Yeah.
the nature of IP addresses and whether or not they're PII, and we
Yep.
could have that theological debate. But except for that, there's not a lot of uh, privacy threatening information in what's being shared. And so I think, and I'm interested in what all of you think, but I think the statute's actually worked. I mean, we've talked about some of the limitations, but the statute has accomplished what it was intended to do, I think, in many ways.
I agree with that. I think there's so much more that it can do. But I just want to point out, so it underpins a lot of that automated indicator sharing. It underpins a lot of the ISAC and ISAL work. It also underpins every new CISA director and new administration has a new program, but it underpins whatever that program is. So in this latest, under Jen Easterly, it was JCDC. So JCDC was authorized by a different statute, but the ability for everybody to convene and come together and share information within that construct, CISA 2015 underpinned that. And there are other programs before JCDC, but it does a lot. It does a lot of work.
Yeah.
I want to take a step back on that privacy point and say, one thing that we saw was the guidance that DOJ and DHS wrote. They did a really great job with it, and they had a lot of discussions with the privacy community. And actually, the privacy community, while they still, I don't know where they stand on the current reauthorization, but on the guidance, they were very positive about the guidance, and were pleased to see that it actually addressed a lot of the concerns that they had that they thought that might not be able to be addressed. So I think that was a really big win in the process to get us to where there's if you follow the guidance, we're going to end up in a place where there's not going to be privacy concerns, and we haven't seen those. We haven't seen the privacy concerns either in private to private sharing or private to government sharing. That some of the opponents of the law predicted it would happen. So that's super positive in the space. But to me, the biggest victory that I've seen in terms of getting people to share, because I do think that the privacy laws have helped some people, some lawyers that were reluctant to share. But I do think that in that competition space for private to private sharing, I've seen the biggest victories there. Some organizations like CTA where the things you would have to sign to in order to get the process to begin to share was putting people off from joining.
Right.
Suddenly, that all goes away when CTA is there. People share the information. There's not really a reason to be concerned about antitrust concerns in the space, and if the sharing happens. So it's sort of a we got rid of a red herring for sharing the information, and we're able to go ahead and do that. We saw that also in other spaces as well. I see Susie Squires on from the hospitality and the retail and hospitality ISAC, and they. Before the FS ISAC people told me they were having trouble sharing with the retail ISAC before because their lawyers were raising antitrust concerns. And then when the law passed and the guidance came through, they were able to share that information. So FS ISAC could then the financial services industry could share with the retail industry in a better way than they were able to before. Those are positive things, right? And I think that that has been a total success. So I think that those are worth pointing out. But there's one more thing that I want to say, which is I think the biggest success, though, is for those of us that worked on cybersecurity for the like 10 years prior to this law passing, the number one issue was information sharing. It was the thing we were talked about all the time was how we can't share information. It's so difficult to share information. The lawyers are stopping us from sharing information. After the law passed, it dropped to number 10, 11, 12, maybe even further down the list. We barely talk about it at this point. If this law fails to be reauthorized, it will become the number one issue again, and will be a huge waste of effort, actually.
Yeah, so let's actually turn to that now. So we've got as we mentioned, there's a sunset clause in the current statute. So the current statute, the authorities in the statute run out on September 30th of this year. So where do we stand with reauthorization? And Mike, maybe I'll start with you since you were saying that some of your folks were just up there, but then want to turn to Amy as well, since I know both of you have been heavily involved in this effort.
Yeah, I would say it's early days, unfortunately, in the conversation at the beginning of this new Congress, but there's been great attention paid by industry stakeholders and by folks on the Hill who want to understand the conversation we've been having this morning. That this is a cornerstone statute upon which so many cybersecurity programs and practices and organizations are reliant. So if you remove that, you're creating a great deal of uncertainty in the space. You're really upending how cybersecurity is done in the modern era. I say modern as compared to 2010, right? So that message is being received by Congress. There is, because it's Congress, a desire to revisit and to update and to change and to put their own stamp on the issue. Certainly, fair play to them. The message that I think most industry partners have been giving to the Hill, and Amy and I have been partnering on this pretty closely, is to try to make sure this doesn't lapse. Let's just raise the stakes there on that piece of this conversation, but also to be really good partners to help them understand. And I think Kemba was talking about it earlier. The terminology could be updated to be more specific. No one's gonna doubt that. And giving some more meat on the bone to that conversation to members of Congress so they can have a good, wholesome conversation. And maybe it becomes a two-track kind of legislative approach where there's some kind of short-term extension of these authorities, of these liability protections, and then a more fulsome conversation over the next 2 years or so, if there want to be improvements to the law. But I'd turn it over to Amy, who comes from a different side of this congressional race.
Yeah. Mike, you make great points, and maybe just kind of stepping back and thinking about from a calendar perspective what we're talking about here and what the options are. You talked about vehicles. Right now, Washington is really dominated by the conversation around the reconciliation bill. That's likely to continue through July 4th, maybe even a little longer, depending on how things go in the House this week. So we're quickly running out of time, to Michael's point with the congressional calendar. You'll have July for some floor action, then you have August recess when the members aren't here, and then we're into September, and this thing expires at the end of September. So you're really talking about something that probably needs to catch a ride, given
Yeah.
the fact that the way the Senate rules work, you either need to have floor time for a bill to be considered, or you need to have a unanimous consent in order to get it passed. So your only other option is to catch a ride. So you're probably talking about looking at the appropriations bill, the CR, whatever happens there at the end of September as a really good candidate. We've had folks also talk about, the NDAA as a place where maybe something like this could ride. The challenge there is that while we'll probably see some action on that within the committees before September, you're not necessarily going to get that wrapped up until December, as it tends to be an end of the year exercise. So this could very well be a situation where there's a CR at the end of September, we get a short-term reauthorization, and then we need to catch another ride to get a little longer. So I think for folks who are following this, buckle up, because it's certainly going to be something that's going to have several steps along the way.
I think just to drill down on one piece that like I thought Amy did a great job there of like laying out the path forward and how Congress is going to be acting over the summer. If it's not a clean reauthorization, if there's a desire to open up some of these terms, all those great points that Ari was raising about the kind of clean bill of health from the privacy and civil liberties community that these programs have been getting so far, it's understandably going to be reopened. The privacy folks are going to want to look at this again and evaluate whether those terms kind of meet the standard that they come to expect from CISA 15 being so successful over the past 10 years. So it's not without some risk, maybe I would say, to have that conversation at this point in the calendar, in terms of the risk being that the protections would lapse. And just a quick shout out to Senators Rounds and Peters, who have a clean reauthorization bill that they introduced on the Senate side. So just to kind of further hit at your point, Michael, there is congressional interest. Folks on the Senate side have acted. We're still waiting for folks on the House to see what their version of CIS 15's reauthorization will look like.
Yeah, and I've become a big fan of this kind of two-track approach of, we need to there's not enough time to do the fulsome debate, right? That you would want to have if you want to update the statute before the clock runs out. So we need to get some sort of reauthorization in place, and then we can have the discussion about, how do you what in the definitions needs to be updated, and then how to actually do it, right? I think that's one of the things the community has not really fully come to a conclusion about. For example, like what, you mentioned ransomware earlier, Mike. Okay, well, what do we need to actually cover in the statute for, ransomware or, AI systems, that sort of thing. And so I think the question, in my view, is really, how does the community start to work on some of those questions in a way that we can have some language that's ready for whatever reauthorization process, more fulsome process comes along?
Ask a different question if it's okay, Mike,
Sure.
just to take your moderator. Genuine question. What committee does this go to in the House? Is it Homeland Security Committee? Where does it go? And where was it in the 2012, 13, 14 time frame? Is that evolved at all? Is that different? And can you help us understand the consequences of that?
Amy, do you want to take this one or do you want me to?
Um, why don't you start and I'll chime in?
Okay, fair enough. It's such a good question, Kemba. So the CISA 15 was passed through the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate. The nexus of activity, though, is in the Homeland Security Committee's lane. The parliamentarians on the Senate have ruled that the Peters Rounds bill is within the jurisdiction of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, his GAC, the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, not the Senate Intelligence Committee. So that gives us a pretty good indication of how it's not this positive, but how the House parliamentarians will think about a bill that comes out of the House to reauthorize or to reopen, explore making changes to CISA 15. My inclination is it'll go to House Homeland Security. But that doesn't mean, of course, it's a different, you can get into all the fun intricacies of parliamentary procedure and how things move, but there are other vehicles potentially that this could ride on, even if the kind of legislative jurisdiction is in the Homeland Security space.
Yeah, Mike, you're absolutely right. I agree with you there in terms of your analysis. To your point earlier, Kemba, part of the difference here right now is that CISA as an agency exists. And because CISA as an agency exists and the jurisdiction has been assigned to his GAC, I think that's part of what changed the view on where this thing lives going forward. I wouldn't be surprised by necessarily a secondary or sequential referral in the House. So you could still see the House Intelligence Committee have some equities there. You also could see just other committees weigh in, even if they don't have an official referral. Sometimes you'll see committees, when something's moving, insert a letter to the record to try to preserve their jurisdiction going forward. So more to come there, since it's a first reauthorization for us. I think everyone's still trying to figure this out a little bit. But it is worth noting that since we are talking about catching a ride, that generally means that the chair and the ranking member of the main committees of jurisdiction have a lot of important sway here, because they typically are the ones that leadership is going to look to say, is it okay if this legislation hitches a ride? So that will make Senator Paul, Senator Peters, along with the folks on the House side, pretty important here.
Yeah, so I think, we're getting close to time here on this discussion, but I think it's really important to, kind of think about some of the places that we would, agree that we want to extend the period, we want to extend the authority. Are there other sort of things that we want to consider that the cybersecurity community should be talking and thinking about, and talking to the privacy community and others about, as we look at this potential reauthorization and relooking at some of the questions? Are there other factors that we should be considering?
We have to change the name of this law.
I was wondering if we were going to
No,
get
I'm
to
serious
that. All
about
right,
this
so Ari, you raised it. So let's talk about the change of the name.
I'm serious about this because when the name of the agency, when I heard that the name of the agency was going to be CISA, I said in 2025, we're going to have a major problem by the fact that that this agency has the same name as the information sharing law. And everyone laughed at me, and literally laughed at me. So I take this extremely seriously. It was a huge mistake to make, and we should have known it at the time. And now we're paying the consequences for it, which is people do not like the agency, and they are going to take it out on this law, which has almost nothing to do with the agency. I understand that the agency oversees pieces of the law, and it's tied to it, but it has not. I mean, like if CISA, the agency, went away, the law could still exist. Right? We would just make some slight changes to it, and it would still exist. If the law went away, CISA has a problem.
Right.
The agency has a problem. So I do think that the naming actually does matter, and it did matter from the beginning, and we do have to change the name of it now. So
Not to hit on that point, Bart, but members of Congress have made the same point. Sorry, Kemba. Yeah.
No, I think a clean reauthorization would be ideal here. And I also, Ari, did not like the new name of NPPD to CISA. I hated the name NPPD. It needed to change. But for other reasons, I didn't like the CISA name for the agency. And so for this reason, CISA, the law, existed before CISA, the agency. So CISA, the law, could exist even if you change the name of the agency. That doesn't matter. The only other thing, now that we're running out of time, in addition to, I agree with Ari, changing the name of the law, we need to figure out where cybersecurity or cyber fraud fits into cybersecurity purpose, because now that we've seen evolution of how people are using information systems in a nefarious way is actually taking place, we need to find a place for identifying and defining and sharing information related to cyber fraud.
Is now a good time to say that I worked on the legislation that created CISA, the agency, and was in many conversations about why it ended up as CISA. But that's drinks later. Don't worry about that.
Not
No,
blaming you,
well, I
Mike.
mean, I was there. I was there back in like 2003 when we were like drafting the legislative proposal from the Bush administration to create the Department of Homeland Security, and it was on a Labor Day weekend, and we were running out of time, and that's how you ended up with National Programs Protection Directorate.
That was a horrible name.
It was like we put it as a placeholder and said, "Oh, we'll come back and fix it later." It took 15 years to get it fixed. So be careful what you do in Washington. That's the lesson from that's the lesson from that, man.
That's right.
Ari,
you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that there's also some other areas that we might want to for long term, right? I don't think we should do it. I think we need a clean reauth right now. But then we can maybe this can help to kick off some discussion about some of these areas like fraud discussion that Kemba's raising. I also think supply chain issues and sharing around supply chain. It's a very hard issue to craft, which is one of the reasons it's not in there now. But yeah, I do think that if you had a long term discussion about it, you could get it done. So
great. Well, as we sort of start to bring things to a close, I'll sort of go around and give everybody an opportunity to, put in your last set of comments for this webinar. Obviously, we will all be engaged in this conversation going forward, and I think that would certainly be my request is that, we really need all of the business community, the cybersecurity community, the legal community, and others to come together to support a reauthorization, and then to have the conversation about how to move forward and what we need to update, because I think it's really critical that we do continue to evolve the statute for both the changes in technology that Mike referenced earlier, but as Kemba said, the changes in what the bad guys are doing and just the evolution of society as a whole. But Amy, maybe I'll start with you for some parting shots here.
Yeah, I think just one ask for folks that are listening to this webinar is help us tell the story. On the Hill, when I talk to members of Congress and their staff, they want examples of how this law has been successful. So if you have an example where you shared information and it helped someone else, or you received information and it allowed you to take quick action that you didn't have to wait for your general counsel to make a decision, that's really helpful to have those little narrative stories. I would point to the National Retail Federation's testimony or statement for the record for the hearing that happened last week is a really great example. They're 2 to 3 sentences, so not looking for a lot of detail, but something that can be really helpful in helping move the ball forward here.
Great. Mike.
Amy stole mine. I thought that's exactly right. The thing I would kind of add on is keeping up the drumbeat is so important, and that's why I really appreciate Michael you putting this together and the work that CTA does to educate and advocate for these kinds of issues to really raise them to prominence, because I think that's something that we started off this conversation a little bit in that place, like policymakers need to hear more about this and its importance, and we're doing that on our end, but keeping this conversation going, I think it's just so critical.
Great. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint specific cybersecurity policy victories throughout time, and this is one of them. We should be really proud of this, and the fact that we are fighting to reauthorize is a little bit scary for other victories we may have down the road, but we do have to fight for it. So, yeah.
Great. Kemba.
And then I guess I'm last here. So I'm going to triple underscore everything that Amy and Mike said and steal those ideas, but also if we don't reauthorize CISA 2015, we move back a decade while the adversary is moving ahead. Also, if we expect more from industry in this cybersecurity ecosystem, if we expect whatever you want to call it, offensive operations, if we expect active defense, if we expect more from industry, allowing this to lapse will cause, in my view, chaos. You will not be able to get what we need to get out of industry getting after this problem.
Well, thank you all for joining me today in this discussion. I mean, I think it's really important, and we do intend to keep up the drumbeat. I mean, this is what we do on a daily basis. Here at CTA, we drive this information sharing, and I think it's really foundational to everything else that we do. And Kemba, you said it quite correctly that this has become a linchpin statute, statutory authority to enabling our cyber defenses, and we certainly don't want to be in a position where we're weakening them, because the adversaries are certainly not growing weaker; they're only getting better, unfortunately. And so this statute, in my view, is a piece of us. It's an enabling statute to enable us to actually go and do the things we want to do to change the cybersecurity equation. But we can't do it if we're moving backwards and constantly refighting sort of old fights. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you and the folks that have watched this webinar and others as we continue to engage the Hill and engage the administration on moving a clean reauthorization forward, and then continuing the discussion about where we go from here. So thank you very much for joining me today. It's been great to have you.